So let me say that several weeks ago I attended the Born This Way Foundation launch at Harvard, where Lady Gaga was there with Oprah. And if you watched, how many of you have watched the YouTube interview with Oprah and Lady Gaga? Okay, you should probably go watch it. So I was excited to be part of that, not because Lady Gaga's, I'm kind of into Lady Gaga, I'm kind of a Madonna person, so not that you can't be both, but you know, I felt like I was betraying Madonna. But so I thought I would go, and it was Harvard, and this would be great, and we're going to speak the truth, only to see that Lady Gaga has somewhat been silenced by whether that's the MacArthur Foundation or the Harvard, or if it's just mainstream, I don't know. But I spent an entire day where you never heard the acronym LGBT or LGB or gender-based or homophobia the entire day until a transgendered youth stood up and asked Lady Gaga. First she said, I used to be a boy, I'm now a girl, introduced himself and said, Lady Gaga, what are you going to do about people that don't understand me? It was the first time that the entire day we were there with all of the experts from across the world that study bullying, that are out there on the ground doing the work, that there was actually a discussion about what we know is so important, and that is making sure that bullying prevention efforts really include those types of things that we're seeing in the research, that kids are saying on the ground, that's affecting their mental health, that's affecting their suicidal ideation. And unfortunately, you know, I'm still fighting with Lady Gaga and Dana Boyd and all of her advisees, so you can't really pick on Lady Gaga. She's got like shows to put together and songs to write, you know, little monsters to kind of monitor. But I think what I encourage you to do is to reach out to Lady Gaga and the Born This Way Foundation and push them to make sure that they have inclusive materials, because what they're putting out to school districts right now does not mention GSAs, LGBT. They're pushing generic bullying prevention programs, so you should know about that. If you want to know more about it, I can actually send you the social-emotional learning document that they're sending out to all public schools that does not include many of even Glissan's work. They wouldn't even put that website on there. They haven't put Groundspark's beautiful videos out there. So let's rally, if you will, rally with me. You know, I'm from Illinois. Why not, you know, more controversy from that state would be, you know, because we don't have enough. So I'm sure the dean of my College of Education would appreciate that. The dean here left, so that's good. They're probably friends. So I've been at it for a really long time. We have a short period of time together, and then some of you will be in the workshop where we'll flush some additional ideas out. But it's very, very clear that it's business as usual when we think about bullying prevention across this country. We're going to continue, it appears, with Lady Gaga's stamp of approval, to push programs that are generic bullying prevention programs that are not inclusive to what we're finding in the research. So my message today is for many of you that are in the room, and even the state superintendent, that if you're going to push these generic programs, please complement and augment them with some really good gender-based, gender identity, you know, heteronormativity research, and start talking to kids as young as we can about sexual identity. Otherwise, we're going to continue to have the problems that we're having. So, wow. So now my work comes through research, and I always, you know, some people tend to not understand that when I present the research, this is the voice of the youth. So as much as I do large-scale quantitative studies, and we do sit down and do focus groups with kids to understand the data really are the voices of the youth. And so as we talk in the next 40 minutes or so about what we're finding and the trends that we're finding and how that leads directly to the practice we should be doing on the ground, I want you to always think these are not my ideas. I'm out in the field, my graduate students are out in the field, undergrads are out in the field. We're asking these questions, and because of research, we've been able to uncover how the phenomenon of bullying has changed drastically in our schools. And for prevention programs that were born out and developed in the 90s and even the early 2000s are not sensitive to the experiences that kids are having in our schools and what they're saying to us. So I'm giving you the tip of the iceberg. It's been 18 years of work, 27 PhDs you don't see behind me. thousands and thousands of undergrads. They're out there trying to understand what the experiences are of youth. At the same time, trying to figure out how science and youth voice can be combined to create safer schools is always the challenge. We're in a kind of environment in which science itself is a bad word, and the science and practice gap is probably the largest I've ever seen in my almost 20 years in career. So what it means is that many of us have to continue to take risks and not necessarily be the most popular person. I have to tell you that the most famous bullying prevention program that's being pushed, and they're making millions of dollars, is a Finnish program called the Dan Olweus Bullying Prevention Program. And he has a letter on his website saying that I'm very unfair, which is fine. And then also the right conservatives have lots of letters about what they think about my agenda and what I'm out there to do, and you can imagine what that says. But today we're going to talk about science. So this isn't necessarily, my opinion, but this is what science is consistently saying in the last decade. I also come to you, and the more I present on this and the more I get frustrated with the pushback that I'm getting and kind of being marginalized in the research community, I remember why I'm here. And some of you may know this and others may not know this, but I had a brother who was gay and in the Navy 25 years ago. And that's, he came out in the military and had a dishonorable discharge. And he was in the nuke program. If you know anything about the nuke program, he's really smart, right? Like really smart, physics and all those kinds of stuff. So here, because of his sexual orientation didn't match with the US Navy, he is now, and he would say that he's living a great life in Seattle, growing orchids, delivering pizzas at the age of 48. But I would say that perhaps it might have been a different trajectory if he had not had his science career interrupted by the military. And we grew up military, so we can kind of talk about Navy. But this is another reason why I'm here, as I see youth who, through our research, are dropping out of school or not attending school or picking careers over other careers because they may be more sensitive to their sexual orientation. That's a problem. We should be very concerned about that. And that's way off, and today we're going to talk about just how anti-bullying programs should kind of consider what we know. Now, this is the reality of bullying prevention. I'm going to speak to you today about this. Now, some of you, maybe not in this audience, but I'll get an email saying, why are you saying those programs aren't effective? I go to the website, you can go to the website of the Department of Education in the United States, the American Medical Association, the Academy of Pediatrics. I can have a long list of everyone in federal government and other types of conventions and conferences and associations that have put a stamp of approval on programs as proven in this country. When you dig deep, and I'm going to tell you specifically, when you dig deep, the efficacy is not there. It's not there. Now, I understand that we have 47 states that have unfunded mandates to have some type of bullying prevention program, framework, or policy in place. And administrators and principals tend to, when they have those mandates, grab programs. That's not going to change. So as much as we can preach, it needs to be a framework, it needs to be a school climate shift. We will still, for a large percentage, have school districts making decisions about purchasing programs. Well, they will continue to have problems if they don't look to the research and understand that it takes more than buying a binder and mandating teachers to implement a program that the districts and the states do not have time to monitor implementation, so therefore fidelity is compromised. And most of these programs that we're pushing are generic, and they want to sell to the masses, so that means they're not going to talk about sexual orientation, they're not going to talk about disability, they're not going to talk about race and all those other things. So again, the message is going to be, if you're going to buy these canned programs, please augment them, supplement them with some really good material around sexual identity, disability, obesity, stigma, whatever it may be, if you want to have an impact. My experience is that there are administrators and superintendents that do care, but they have a lot on their plate with the focus on testing, right? So let's talk about the meta-analysis. Many of you, how many are, there's lots of high school kids, right? High school kids, where you at? That's good. You! So I want you to take this message back to your school districts, and if you find that they're pushing some of these canned programs, we'll talk about this. High school kids and college kids that are in the audience, this is probably going to be well worth you coming. And middle school. Oh, you're kidding. Where are the middle schoolers? Woo. Well, this is where this is, whew. Good luck. They say it gets better. I hope it does. Than middle school. One reason I'm pointing out the students is that many of you in middle school and high school may not know the meta-analytic study, and if you do, then you're probably in a really good school. If you know what this is, essentially it's a statistical summary of a research literature, right? So if you're going to do a paper in middle school and high school on adolescent depression and the treatment of that, find the meta-analytic study, because what they've done is they've reviewed the 200 articles on that topic. You go right to their reference, there you go. Your literature review is done. But essentially what we use it for is to take a summary of a body of literature and apply statistics and say, okay, what works, what's efficacious, but what works under what conditions? Now, the adolescent depression I take as for example because if you did a meta-analysis of adolescent depression, you would probably have about 1,000 articles to review and code and do all that fancy Cohen's D. In the area of bullying, and this is not a typo on my slide, we have the first meta-analysis that was able to be conducted within the US and outside the US in 2008. Now we have upwards of, depending on how you define program or framework, between 60 and 120 bullying prevention programs, from dancing and singing with the kids, theater drama groups, nothing against, I love theater, but I'm not sure that's going to change how we think about bullying in this country and homophobic teasing, all the way to comprehensive social-emotional learning programs, positive behavior supports. Why is it that only in 2008 were we able to summarize and say what works, given that we have, in quotes, lots of proven programs? Now, what's even more depressing, and I know, unless you're like a budding academic, you probably don't see where this would bring you to tears, but it brings me to tears that it's 2008 and we only have 16 studies to evaluate. That's pretty embarrassing. And only 6 studies were in the US, and the tears should start to flow even more, because 2 of the 6 studies were published. We sit here at an institution, and peer review drives these institutions. So I'm a little more embarrassed that, in fact, there's only 2 of the US studies that were published. Again, remember, we have proven programs in this country that all of your school districts are implementing. Bottom line in the meta-analysis is that all of these studies showed small to negligible results. There was no reduction in bullying. Now, I'll put a positive slant on it, and sometimes I sit there when they introduce me like, try to be positive, Dorothy, try to be positive. Be positive. Okay. So small positive effects, meaning that you're going to change the p-value from 0.05 to 0.10. And for the middle and high school students that want to know about that, we should probably recruit you to Wisconsin schools or Illinois schools, because that's just fun. So small positive effects found for enhancing social competence and peer acceptance. So those programs that actually tried to get kids to like each other and get along had some direction of shifting in bullying behavior. Makes sense. Increasing teaching knowledge and efficacy in implementing interventions. I will tell you what, we've done a great disservice, although it sounds like you've done some great professional development work in Wisconsin. What we have done for many, many decades is to talk to kids about bullying, and the Finland program is really, you have these class meetings and you talk, and you do serious talking to with a bully. And then, you know, we talk to the kids, we might even improve their social emotional learning skills, and then we place them back in the very environments with the teacher that may be lacking some social emotional learning skills. We place them into an environment in which the teachers themselves may have their own issues around homophobia. We place them into schools in which the counselors aren't really counseling anymore because they're teaching to the test and benchmarks and all kinds of things. So, but what we haven't done is to say to teachers, what's preventing you from creating a positive climate in your classroom and accepting and engaging and developing relationships with your kids? We haven't done that. And in some ways, that's our fault as researchers and as policymakers to say, why have we focused on the kids so much when we all adopt a social ecological perspective? When we all recognize when teachers know their students and students know their teachers, that leads to better academic outcomes. And it also leads to kids wanting to come to school and other types of things. And perhaps if they like each other, there's less bullying over time. Unfortunately, we're not doing that. Now, in that meta-analysis in 2008, again, bottom line is there was no impact on bullying behavior. And, word of the day, heterogenic effects. In fact, in some of those studies, the bullying got worse. Because there's nothing worse than being in a social-emotional learning exercise talking about bullying when your perpetrator's sitting across the room and they're honing the skills of the bully and the bully group, and you're sitting there as a victim. Most of these universal programs don't address those other types of things that we need to get to. Now, the Farrington, the UK group, has done an additional meta-analysis. This is even more depressing because, and if anyone wants to read this, I welcome you to read this. I'll send it to the Department of Instruction for sure. And what you want to read is go back to the many, many pages in the appendices where they have a column of a study, then they have a column of the country. And if you go to the column of the country and it says US and you move over to the Cohen's effect size, you will see that every single study they reviewed in the United States did not reduce bullying. Now, because our federal government is so smart, the National Institutes of Justice generals stood up at the White House conference and said, and we have from the Farrington and Tofty report proven programs that will help us in our schools. And of course, I whispered, troublemaker Irish that I am, I whispered to somebody who's like, the talking points, whoever did the talking points for her, they probably need to lose their job. Because you're NIJ, National Institutes of Justice, you're pushing bullying prevention programs that only worked in European countries and not a single study worked in the US. That's a problem. Now that's the truth. And if many of you are probably uncomfortable, like we have the dance program, we have the Ole's bullying prevention program, we have this, I'm gonna shed some light a little bit on that. So that's the reality. That isn't me making it up. Effect sizes are pretty much the true thing. Now, we should recognize that in order to even be in a strategic, this kind of meta-analysis, you have to have rigorous methods. So these meta-analysis, unfortunately, do not address many of the programs, whether they're media campaigns, grassroots organizations, the work that G-Safe is doing, because the federal government's not going to give G-Safe millions and millions of dollars to test their program. They're just not. Let me tell you what also these meta-analyses and the interpretation of these meta-analyses has done in the United States. That every time any one of us wants to write about bullying prevention, a grant, federal panels will say, how does it compare to the gold standard of the OES bullying prevention program? How does it compare? So we have a miss. So even if right now as we speak, we're writing a grant to try to get the federal government to say, look, we want to do social emotional learning plus training their teachers around sexual identity, training the teachers to be able to talk about respectfully within their classroom sexual identity and gender-based harassment. But if the federal government says, why do we need to fund any of this because we already have proven programs, what are we going to do? I mean, I know you guys probably don't lay at night. I lay in bed at night hoping that this problem will be solved. And unfortunately, it's getting worse. Anyway, so why are they not working? Well, the majority of the programs fail to recognize that, bullying is not an isolated phenomenon. From my perspective, and it has been after interviewing hundreds of thousands and serving hundreds of thousands of kids and teachers, for me, bullying is a symptom of a problem in our society. Increasingly, within the last decade, we have found that upwards of 35 to 50% of bullying is homophobic in nature. 10, 15 years ago when we interviewed kids, when they would use homophobic banter, it didn't appear to have the socialization process that it has now. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later. But what we need to recognize is that bullying co-occurs with a lot of other issues that we have within the context of negative school climate. It's a lack of tolerance for difference that I've spoke about for decades. Bullying is the outcome of a problematic process and environment. We also know that increasingly LGBT kids who are victimized chronically, that do not have social support at home, that may have been marginalized by their own family, and kids that identify as straight who are chronically victimized are using alcohol and drugs at a very, very high rate across this country. They are coping with their victimization. Yes, there's depression, but the early onset of drugs and alcohol is happening 5th and 6th and 7th grade for kids that are chronically victimized in our schools. So we have to recognize too, as we have limited resources in our schools, do we need a program for every problem? Or can we understand that the research shows that there's overlapping risk and protective factors for a lot of these outcomes, including bullying, sexual violence, homophobic bantering, alcohol and drug use, teenage pregnancy. If we look to the literature of many decades, we'll recognize that Hawkins and Kalana have talked about the spectrum of problem behavior. So we have to think about, in this limited resource, do we want to have a program that just kind of speaks to bullying, or should we have one that gives kids the opportunity to interact and understand diversity, for teachers to get to know their students? So I've talked about the overlapping risk and protective factors. We also realize in our research that homophobia and bullying is maintained by peers. Now, we have middle school students in here, and in middle school, us researchers talk about that time where that's early adolescence, and you just kind of want to fit in, and you don't want to, have too much attention called to yourself, and you want, for the most part, to be part of the popular group, and you find yourself engaging in ways that's even unnatural for you, that you might engage in bullying when that's probably not the way in which your parents taught you to interact. Many of you still may, be involved in faith-based organizations that would promote diversity, yet you're in a school in which teasing and harassing is just part of what you do. We recognize very clearly through our quantitative methods that bullying, homophobic bullying, sexual violence is only initiated and maintained through the peer group. And only one of these programs of bullying prevention actually proposes to shift the peer norms. And I'm not sure that it actually does that. We're testing that right now. But until we recognize that the youth are maintaining this behavior, and if we continue to promote programs that do not include a youth voice, then we're talking over here, you guys are interacting over here, right? So even the definition of bullying, a lot of you kids, you may not even identify with the definition of bullying. It's mean behavior, it's isolating behavior, it's drama, it's generally hurtful behavior. So we have to think more about creatively, and I know you will across the course of the day. Think about how we engage peers and shift that peer norms, but I think it has to be somewhat youth-driven, for sure. We also have focused tremendous amount on universal and primary programs. There's not a lot of programs or frameworks out there for when someone has been marginalized or ostracized in a school and is kind of slipping away. Or when somebody has an identified depression, anxiety problem. Where do kids go? And of course, GSAFE and other environments, organizations offer that. But the bottom line is these programs fail to address demographic variables such as gender, race, sexual orientation, other types of things. The one study that's for the proven program of the OLE's Bullying Prevention Program, actually there's one study that found that it works only for white kids and not for Asian or black students, which increasingly we're finding in the area of bullying prevention that the generic programs tend to help a certain type of kid. And we have no idea whether or not these programs affect homophobic engagement or sexual violence, because oftentimes we're not allowed to even measure those variables in these studies. I had the director of the Institute of Educational Science. I informed him that his federal panel, his reviewer panels, asked me to take out my sexual orientation item in my RCT, and he said they're not allowed to do that. And he's an out gay director of Institute of Educational Sciences, and he had no idea that he was putting review panels together that didn't understand why we would even collect sexual orientation as a variable. That's a problem, so therefore we can't even understand the extent to which these programs are even having an impact for the very population that we're concerned about. We also have to consider classroom management. Teachers are stressed, they're burnt out. If we're going to continue with these programs, which I think we're going to, the ship has sailed in some ways, I tend to say, we need to recognize that some teachers are so stressed out in their classroom that they cannot even get through a math lesson, more or less a lesson on sexual orientation or sexual harassment. So we have to recognize that. Teaching profession is one of the top 5 hazardous occupations. Between 7 and 12% of teachers are physically assaulted a year. So you should think long and clear about that. We also, this is my mantra the last few months, I'm not convinced that all of our schools really want to do something about bullying. I think for many of you that come from schools where you have an administrator that's supportive of even producing a GSA, I'm in many schools where just that acronym itself shuts down the conversation right? So we work with those school districts and the reluctance, and we'll have equity and all kinds of different names for that. But I think as a society, if we think about bullying and harassment and this marginalization that seems to be increasing in our society, we have to recognize, again, bullying is the symptom, but bullying is a relationship problem. It's an intergenerational problem, and until we get the adults kind of to model more inclusive behavior, it's going to be a challenge to get the kids to do this. Now, many of you have probably pushed the envelope and you've upset administration in your schools to make things happen, and I say bravo to you. But we need many more brave individuals, because I will tell you there's a lot of kids that are not so brave, especially in middle school. You don't want to necessarily call yourself out as being different. And again, I'm talking to the folks that have done that risky behavior, but I think if we continue to run around and really think that people want to prevent bullying, I think if we really wanted to prevent it, we could have done it by now. I mean, it's good job security for me for people to just not want to really, really face the issue, right? So I've got about 15 more years of this, and it looks like it's going. So I think we need to have a real serious conversation. We have the Bully Project movie that's coming out tomorrow, right? How many have seen this full movie? Okay, well, box of tissues, okay? When it comes out, take a box of tissues. And so the Bully Project, yes, it does come out tomorrow, and in this, what they show very nicely is how the adults and the administrators, I'm kind of giving it away a little bit, but not too much, the adults and the administrators actually contribute to the problem and have their head in the sand and actually have etrogenic effects, right? But at the same time, one of the characters within that school, and this is my fear, when I work with kids around bullying issues or ostracizing or marginalization, we have a real keen ability to point out a flaw in someone and say, well, no wonder he's bullied. No wonder she's bullied. Look at her, right? Which disturbs me anyway. But in that movie, I fear that's what folks are going to say. So we need to recognize as a society, I'm not convinced, we made a decision with No Child Left Behind that we were going to track every single grade and test a child at the individual level is done, and we've done it. Have we not? Many of you are generations of test takers, I know. We didn't take all these tests when I was a kid. It was kind of cool. We just kind of wung it, and maybe we cheated, I don't know, but but you can't cheat on these tests. So essentially we've done this idea, we've tracked academics, but there's a real reluctance to track school climate, to track the very kids that are being chronically victimized. So we have to have a serious conversation about motivation. So the bottom line is the ship has sailed. We're going to continue to promote programs that are not inclusive. We're going to continue to promote programs that are not talking about what the science is saying. So I will continue to fight that fight, but I can tell you I'm being marginalized extremely, like in bad ways, even by my colleagues, right? So once your colleagues kind of marginalize you, it's a lonely world I live in. And sometimes I sing that song. Often, actually, she leads a lonely life, and I love that song, but it will motivate me. So what you need to do is to continue doing what you're doing. If you're in a school, middle school and high school students, where they're bringing in these canned programs, talk to them about supplementing it with something around bias-based discussions. And it doesn't take too much to do this, and we'll talk more about this in the workshop. Okay, so there's a number of demonstrations where the developmental science really is not informing practice, and I think I've kind of hit you that over the head a little bit in the last 28 minutes. But you should recognize, as we were doing this research, we began to increasingly hear from kids, and I'm going to present some Dane County data, but kids across the nation, in the state of Illinois, all over the place, even in San Francisco of all places, where just large percentage of kids were talking about this homophobic slurs. Even straight identified kids are somewhat disturbed by the homophobic, toxic environments that they're surrounded by. So we have to recognize also that LGBT youth, increasingly, when we started to do studies and actually ask sexual orientation and sexual attraction and other types of things, we're reporting high rates of victimization. But what I want to talk to you about is the 2009 Dane County Youth Assessment. We've been working with Dane County and Brian Knogg and the Dane County Youth Assessment, and many of you folks are here. And so I present all over the world, and everybody knows Dane County now. They have no idea probably where it is. And I was like, it's a really cool state where they actually care about their adolescents, to ask them about certain things. I want to present some of these data because this is important. For one, this paper was published in the leading educational journal. So it was published in Educational Researchers. This is a big step. This is the largest organization of educational researchers. It was a lead article. They took a risk to publish these data around LGBT youth. It got quite a bit of attention. What did we find? So in Dane County, we surveyed a bunch of kids in middle school and high school. I didn't, but folks in the room have done this for many years. We get to analyze the data, so we appreciate that. And what we did is we compared straight identified youth, LGBTQ, and we found that, in fact, LGBTQ youth had higher rates of suicide thoughts, suicide attempts, victimization by peers, high levels of unexcused absences. One reason this was published is that I got real smart, because people, when you do this kind of work, people are like, well, are they really being truthful about their sexual orientation, or is there a bunch of straight kids like making stuff up and being jokesters? So I got tired of that response, so I brought a major statistician in, and I said, can you fix this problem? And he did, and he was able to identify the jokesters in the data set, right? So those straight kids that were like, I'm this, I'm this. So we actually took those kids out and found, he did some statistical magic. I can't explain it, but he did something. But what we found, thank you, what we found is that actually the LGBTQ community was quite diverse in their risk profiles. So that many of the LGBT youth did not report these types of outcomes, these adverse outcomes. But what we did find is when they did report it, they reported it earlier. So the risk profile started in 7th grade for LGBTQ youth, but the risk profile for straight identified kids really started in 9th grade, okay? Now, we didn't measure before 7th grade in Dane County, so we have no idea when the risk started, but at least in this data set, it was showing that the majority of the LGBT youth were not at risk. However, the disproportionate number that were at the moderate or high and early onset of these outcomes is problematic. Also, we know that when the LGBT youth were reporting suicidal ideation, it was at a high frequency, and when they were talking about suicide attempts, there were multiple attempts over time. Multiple. So we're concerned about that. Now, while some of these developmental patterns are common to straight and LGBT-identified students, there were significant differences between those students and developmental trends, meaning it started earlier, and unexcused absences. We were seeing that the kids were reporting, and again, this isn't a longitudinal study, but it's more of a cross-sectional study, that 7th graders who identified as LGBT were saying that they were thinking about not coming to school or not attending school or having unexcused absences. Now, what has happened in this country, however, is that because of the media covering the LGBT suicides, or the suicides that have been linked to bullying related to gender identity issues and sexual identity issues, is that the general public's left with this notion that, one, LGBT youth are pathological and they're all suicidal. And that bullying in the schools actually pushed them to greater ideation and attempts. So what we've tried to do is to counter this argument, because we wholeheartedly believe that even if we had the silver bullet of a bully prevention program that eradicated bullying in our schools, and clearly I've shown you that we don't necessarily have that, that there's this assumption that LGBT youth, those that are at risk, would be okay, that all of their ills in society can be linked to victimization at school. Now, everybody in this room knows that that's not the case. Now, what we did in this data set is we controlled for victimization. So if we just made it so that victimization kind of goes away, there was still a discrepancy in these outcomes for LGBT youth and straight identified youth, those that were reporting these adverse outcomes. What does this mean? It means that depression, anxiety, suicidality, unexcused absences, disengagement from school among the at-risk LGBT youth, which is a small percentage of the population, those discrepancies with straight identified kids is not explained just by victimization. And we know that they're dealing with social support issues at home, rejection, even being displaced out of their home, that society's stigma. There was just a report that came out that said that when LGBT adults go into retirement homes. I don't know if you saw this. They're having to go back into the closet, if you will, right? So this idea that it gets better, we need to recognize that maybe it doesn't always get better for everybody, and that bullying at school doesn't explain all the discrepancies in mental health outcomes for LGBT youth that are at risk. I said it about 4 different ways, and I think you got it. Okay. So, and I also want to make a point, and many people know that I've tried to go out there and, show Dane County data to everyone. And early on in the 2000s, when we were out there presenting Dane County data, I used to just show the high rates of suicidal ideation and attempts. And I thought, okay, this will make people want to do something. Well, was I wrong in some ways? And after being escorted out of many towns, after showing suicidal ideation and talking about LGBT, which they thought was promoting homosexuality, right? Paul Poteet and I worked with Brian Connaught and the Dane County folks to think about different ways of convincing stakeholders, school administrators, teachers, that perhaps the climates in which youth are spending a lot of their time, maybe we do have the suicidal, but maybe we're creating a climate in which folks may not want them around. So we tried something different in 2005 and 2008, and you can email me for this publication, but essentially I'm going to make it really quick here. We asked kids in this study the extent to which they agreed with the statement, I could never stay friends with someone who has told me he or she was gay or lesbian, and this is Dane County data, and this was in 2005. In grade 7, 1 out of 3 kids said I would not stay friends with a person, and it's largely males within this sample, females a little bit more open to staying friends with LGBT youth that come out to them. And as you see kind of an optimistic decline in those that agree with this statement. So by the time you're in the 12th grade, 10% said they would not stay friends. We feed these data back to schools that actually invite us back to know their data, and I know that Brian and others go back to these schools, and this is a great way to have a conversation with youth in the school, and I could talk more about this, and if you're in your workshop and you want to know more about it, but this seems to open a discourse much more easily than just saying that LGBT youth are going to hurt themselves. This actually shows that their very support of friendship in middle school and high school may be taking away as they take the risk to try to come out to somebody, and that's problematic. Combine that with the fact that most of them will come out to a teacher that hasn't been trained, unless they're just kind of with it and they get it and they're cool and they're secure. But for the most part, our College of Educations haven't trained pre-service teachers and your teachers to even begin to address sexual identity or sexual orientation. So we're trying to paint a picture of that. These environments are becoming much more kind of toxic, if you will. So what about this question? I would rather attend a school where there are no gay or lesbian students, 1 out of 5 in Dane County. Now this varies tremendously by school. But in this data set, a 7th grader, 1 out of 2. For me, that harkens back to I would appreciate if black people were not in my school. So this bothers me. This is a marker of school climate. This is a marker of a school climate in a situation in which kids that may not even know what they're attracted to, who they are, they're in a place in which probably heteronormativity is being promoted, and therefore they're either silenced about their gender identity or in large part their gender identity is attacked. Okay. We also know a number of different studies that LGBT kind of bullying is driven by peers. We have to change the peer norm that promotes this marginalization. In addition to this is a longitudinal study. I am trying to get the federal government, your rape prevention educators, your educators in the schools to recognize that homophobic bantering is not a benign phenomenon. That in fact, we're finding, I have to tell you, I mean, it's some of the most beautiful, anybody that's quantitatively oriented that just wants to hang with us in Champaign, the models that we are finding. And my theory was always there because when you talk to kids and you look at the data and you really see what kids are dealing with through focus groups and interviews about this language, I just knew that it was doing something. And so this was published in the Journal of Adolescent Health, where we showed that bullying perpetrations longitudinal predicted sexual harassment perpetration. Now in middle school, sexual harassment is mostly homophobic bantering or spreading of rumors of who you did, when you did it, and that you're gay and who you're having the relationships with, right? We're not having completed rape or sexual assault, thank goodness, in middle school. So sexual harassment is kind of a proxy for homophobic bantering. But what we find when we only kind of look at groping and inappropriate touching and the nervous game and all the great stuff that happens in middle school, some of you know the nervous game. I know you know it in Dane County in Wisconsin. You guys are practicing this game. And if you don't, ask me afterwards. If we had time, usually I'd have somebody demonstrate it. But we don't have time. So, because some parents in the room are like, what do you mean? I was like, yeah, there's a nervous game. Ask about it. It's actually, the Supreme Court would call it sexual harassment. So what we also find here is that homophobic teasing perpetration is also associated with sexual harassment, right? So remember, sexual harassment is illegal. We have a Supreme Court decision that says you cannot sexually harass peer on peer or teacher on peer. This is where our teeth will be, I'm telling you, with homophobic bantering. The reason we have an Office of Civil Rights letter that's written to every school district in this country, many of which have not read the letter says, you continue to call everything bullying, you will get a visit from Office of Civil Rights. If, in fact, someone's calling you gay incessantly, if someone's saying that you're having sexual relations in a same-sex relationship and spreading that rumor, and it makes you feel uncomfortable at school, and it's unwanted rumors, like who wants that spread about you, or if you're constantly being called these names, guess what? And it interferes, it's unwanted, and it interferes with your education. It's not bullying, it's sexual harassment. And it's harassment related to your sexual orientation and sexual identity. It took us 10 years to get the Office of Civil Rights, one, to open their door and recognize that the practice of calling everything bullying is a great disservice to us, to the youth, to all of those kids in the school, when in fact bullying is sexual harassment. And this shows that homophobia plays a very, very key role in creating climates in which sexual harassment is tolerated. I know, I'm going to show you the next slide. And many of you are going to say, no way. I know, you're ready. That's right. Look at that. Okay, so this is exciting, and this took a long time. But what this says is, and I'm a social scientist, and this is the only time I've ever really said this, bullying, the generic bullying, name-calling, for whatever attribute they don't appreciate in you, is causally linked to homophobic bantering. I know, that probably doesn't do much for you. It's going to do great things. What it says is that this isn't accidental. That in fact, bullying, garden variety bullying, name calling because of your weight or your nose or your head or whatever the attribute is they're picking on, then leads to, and this is a longitudinal study, about 2.5 years, 5 time points from 5th grade to 7th grade. And what we see is this transactional pattern, that bullying seems to morph into homophobic bantering, where they're calling each other fag, dyke, homo on a regular basis. Okay, so this is causal link. Because we don't have time, we have like 5 papers under review. Now let me unpack this for you. So we not only have a causal link, so that, because I have reviewers that say, well, isn't it just the same thing? Hell no, it's not the same thing. They're related. There's a socialization process, but being called, you know, Four Eyes is different than being called, not to say that anything should be called, but being called gay or attacking your sexual identity on a regular, it's just different. It's different, it's not the same, I'm not gonna lump it together. So we know that bullying perpetration is causally linked, but we also know that the link between bullying perpetration and sexual harassment is moderated by homophobic teasing. If I'm a bully in 5th grade, I will sexually harass by 7th grade if I hold a homophobic kind of attitude towards you. That's just what I'm going to do. We also know that bullying and homophobic perpetration, you're going to love this one, oh yes, the relationship is stronger if you hold a traditional view of masculinity. If you say, boys shouldn't cry, boys should talk about their sexual prowess, la, 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 you're going to have that connection. Now, what I say to preventionists, I was like, this is pretty darn simple. Why don't we talk to kids about multiple masculinities? Why don't we talk to kids about gender expression? You should have seen the diagram for that one. That was Now, I know I have like 2 or 3 minutes, and I don't have many slides left, so I'm really proud of myself. And so, you can imagine that schools, there's a lot of pushback when I come in and say, well, I'd like to, show straight-laced, or it's elementary, or it's still elementary, and these are all from groundspark.org, great videos that you should show to kids and really young kids, and I want to talk to second graders about homosexuality and sexual orientation. So you can imagine in some of the communities in the United States that this doesn't go over very well. I usually don't even get a meeting in some of these schools. So I've thought okay, let me just, baby steps, which I'm not really good at. So, but what I've tried to do with rape prevention educators that are out in the field, they're trying to prevent bullying, they're trying to understand sexual harassment, they don't really get homophobic stuff because they're uncomfortable with it. But so they're all focusing on bullying. And I said, okay, can we just, based on some research that we have that says that 35 to 50% of bullying is homophobic in nature, can we start a movement where that language itself is not allowed? We don't say the N-word, for the most part. We feel pretty good about that. In special ed, we're starting not using the R word. Can we just not allow this language? If you look at the GLSEN reports, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, they just released an elementary school study. The kids are saying, look, this is the banter, this happens all the time, teachers do nothing about it. Teachers don't say, hey, we don't use that language here. So can we start with that? We don't use this language here. Our studies actually too show that homophobia creates a venue for boys and girls to sexually harass one another. Because if, in fact, I'm in a school where there's bullying, which now is causally linked to homophobic banter, and there's heteronormativity, the best way to demonstrate that you're not gay is to publicly touch the opposite sex. It's called sexual harassment, right? So, in fact, if we're not Title IX compliant, which we're not for sexual harassment, kids don't really even know what sexual harassment is. They're playing a nervous game, which is uncomfortable. That, we got a lot of work to do, but can we start with, how about that language isn't acceptable here? Or, I don't know, a lot of my feminist friends before me would say, can we start to understand gender identity again? Can we start to understand the violence as gender-based within the context of our schools? Can we have a conversation that you throw like a girl, that really just denigrates girls, right? So you see the complexity of what that is, okay. Alrighty, so I say here, I've got some website. Many of you, do you know GroundSpark videos? Yay, go GroundSpark. Okay, if you don't, just go www.groundspark.org. In addition, this is not on this slide, but GLSEN has released a number of different reports on their website. Please go check it out. They also are having a competition that Born This Way Foundation will give an award for the most outstanding GSA. Why not give it to somebody in Wisconsin, I say. Yeah. So I'll write a letter to Lady Gaga. I'm sure that'll go over well. She'll be like, isn't that girl, that woman in Illinois that's saying bad things about us? But now that I think about it, but go on that website and you'll see it. It's right there. It says best GSA. So I think Wisconsin, and I'll write a letter. So that's it. That's all I got.